Welcome back, everybody. This session, Mischief or Miscalculation, China and the Rise of Confusion or Confucianism. I'd like to hand over to the inimitable Steve Clemons, Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic, who's moderating this session.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you today. We've got a fantastic panel. We have, to my far right, Kazuyuki Yamazaki, Ambassador for Policy Planning and International Security Affairs at Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We then have Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Jim Miller. Then we have the editorial director of India Today and a real star last year's program. I enjoyed our encounter last year, and I expect some similar feistiness, Mobashar Javed Akbar. And finally, we have Vice Admiral Paul Madison, who is Commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you all very much for joining us. You know, when I was thinking about the title today and thinking about our panel, it occurred to me, and I went online to sort of find a Chinese event that's being held right now looking at U.S. grand strategy, Canada, Japan, and India. And there are no Canadians, Japanese, Americans, or Canadians on China's panel. We don't have any Chinese with us today, but we should have a lot of fun discussing not only national strategies, what's involving in the Asia-Pacific region and with China, but I wanted to acknowledge that voice wasn't with us today, and that might give us a little more room to run. Because we don't have a Chinese voice on stage, some years ago I went to China and visited with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I met the equivalent of their policy planning director, and I said, aha, finally, I can ask China what its grand strategy is. This was about 2004, and I said, you know, what's your grand strategy? He says, how to keep you Americans distracted in small Middle Eastern countries. That seems to be shifting. And so as we discuss this, one of the really interesting things, again, I know this is not a U.S. panel, but just 2 days ago, our National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, gave a very interesting speech at the Center for Strategic International Studies that really laid out the reasons and rationale for a reset and a rebalancing of American assets in the world, not you know, looking at overweighted areas and underweighted areas. And I want to open with Jim because he gave a talk about why Asia-Pacific was important, but it took him a long time to get to the China section of that. So I'd love you to share with you how you see. You're not just an Asia person, you're a global person. There's a lot of things going on in the world. Israel-Palestine is blowing up again. You've got a lot of things happening. So does this reset make sense?
Steve, our rebalance to the Asia-Pacific makes eminent sense for the United States, and it makes sense indeed globally. If we had not been in the conflicts in Iraq and in Afghanistan over the last decade and decade plus, you would see our attention as a nation, and including our military force posture, already having a greater presence in the Asia-Pacific. And as we look at the importance of the region, as we look at the vitality of economic growth, we expect to see 50% of economic growth in the coming decades in the Asia-Pacific region. And as we look at the tremendous opportunities that we have there economically, as well as our strong alliances and other partnerships, and in the context of a China that is rising in economic power, it's growing its military, it's clear that it makes eminent sense for us to rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, even as we continue to pay attention and continue to stay engaged globally.
So is there a zero-sum game? And one of the things that's really interesting is that when America was there was, 10, 15 years ago, there was the sort of shift to Asia then. So this is maybe the shift to Asia 2.0. But at that time, when you had the shift to Asia, our friends in Europe, there are many of them here, said, oh, you're going to neglect us. At that point, I don't think it was a fair comparison because I didn't feel that American resources were stretched to such a point that there was a zero-sum game between one part of the world. But this is now being presented like it is a zero-sum game. Like you can't do it all. We had an Atlantic cover story recently by Anne-Marie Slaughter that wasn't about foreign policy, but the title of it was provocative. It said, why women still can't have it all. But it does raise the question of, can America still have it all? And my sense is, in the way that Tom Donilon has framed that, the answer is no, that there are limits.
Steve, even as we rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, we have continued our deep engagements with other regions and other countries. Just as one example, in our defense strategic guidance put out in January, we talked about NATO as having become a net provider of security, and I think you see that over the last couple of decades, and you see it ongoing today. We will continue to be engaged in obviously in the Middle East and North Africa and globally. The United States is a global power. It is not a zero-sum game, particularly when you look at the importance of alliances and partnerships, both within the Asia-Pacific and globally. And our intention and our objective is to continue to strengthen those alliances and partnerships. And if we then, if I can pivot to the topic of China briefly, to build on the areas of cooperation that we have across the board, including militarily, and because we know that there's going to be competition, particularly in the military domain, to work to shape any competition in a way that avoids conflict, that avoids the possibility of misperception, misunderstanding, and actions based on that.
Yamazaki-san, you've just come off spending a couple of years in China. You said they were fun personally, but professionally kind of tough. Japan and China are having a square off about 5 uninhabited islands. And Hillary Clinton just received a confidential report that involves Steve Hadley, Richard Armitage, Joe Nye, and another one I can't quite recall for a moment, who said this could slip into a war, this could slip into a hot conflict. We need to be prepared. And under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Peace Treaty, the United States is obligated not necessarily to rush to Japan's defense, but to consult with Japan, which now we have to decide what consult means in particular. But you've had a tough time. China is boycotting Japan informally across a lot of sectors. And so I'd love to get your sense of what you think China's game plan is, both regionally and internationally. Japan has been, you've been there right next to China for a long time, and you've been poking each other back and forth for a long time. So I'd love to get your quick snapshot, if you will, of how you see China's direction.
I think this is I think this is not a short-time phenomenon. From our viewpoint, the China on the Senkaku Island, where we have a diplomatic issue, this problem with China, they started to claim the island in 1971 after the United Nations issued a report in 1969. There's a potential where the oil reserve exists in that area. And we integrated the island to the Japanese territory in 1895, about 120 years ago. And for the first 75 years, we have never received any claim from Republic of China as well as the People's Republic of China. And after the UN report, they changed the position and started to claim the island. And today, I don't want to get into the details of the facts surrounding the island. This is a multilateral forum, and should have a global perspective. And but I'd like to invite the audience to the two elements. One is this is not a kind of isolated issue. In South China Sea, China is trying to advance in the relationship with the Philippines, Vietnam, and other ASEAN countries. They claim the islands and reefs in South China Sea. And the East China Sea, there's an issue with Japan. And from Japanese archipelago to Taiwan, the Philippines, and Borneo, this is called the first island line. From the viewpoint of China, the series of islands exist in the Pacific, and China openly expressed their strong interest in on the maritime security and also the territorial claim along those islands. And so the East China Sea Senkaku Island issue is not isolated one. This is a kind of comprehensive Chinese maritime strategy to advance toward the Pacific.
So that's an important point. And what you're basically saying is that this is about power.
Yes.
And the powerful, which China is clearly becoming more powerful, the powerful write history, rewrite history. You're seeing lines challenged. And I remember talking to George Soros once after he so-called broke the Bank of England. And what he saw as a hedge fund manager as a chance to basically drive so hard against a line that fundamentally the institutional power on the Bank of England side had to collapse. And I've looked at Asia and these tests of power in the region, the tests of the lines that used to be there, whether it was the EP3 incident in 2001, whether it was China's more vociferous and robust complaints about South Korean American naval exercises, or the sailor that was detained by Japan and taken into custody for a while. Do you think that this is essentially China's rise to test the solvency and strength and direction of U.S.-Japan relations? And if you do think it's that, the more provocative question, again, coming to your own national strategy, because Japan is a rich nation, but it's an aging nation. It's a shrinking nation. It has, when you look at it, one wonders, what is Japan's strategy in the region with alliance, and how do you keep yourself vital and robust when China may be saying, when you look at long lines, Japan will become less significant over time. We're going to become more significant over time. And if I can just add one last element, when the President Obama's National Security Strategy report was released, there was a very young analyst that many of us read in China and the PLA who said America is undergoing a period of strategic contraction. Now, he may be wrong. I'd love to hear the counterposition to that. But there are these assessments that this is the time for China to push these boundaries out. And so what do you take in terms of how you look at it in Japan? And is this something where China is trying to force a break, like George Soros with the Bank of England, in a different sphere?
I think that China is a kind of a challenger of the status quo. And for the past 4 years, starting from 2008, when the year happens to be the Beijing Olympics took place, they started to send quasi-military vessels to the Japan's territorial water surrounding the Senkaku Islands. So this is a new dimension. And also, my understanding is that China is more aggressive in the South China Sea. So apparently, I think they are changing, status quo. So as you mentioned, that for us, generally speaking, the Japan-U.S. alliance is very, very important, critical. And this is a kind of public asset in the Asia-Pacific, not only to protect Japan, this is a strong stabilizing factor for the region. So we continue to cherish the alliance.
Admiral Madison, you run the Navy. Kind of a cool job.
Yep. Very cool.
Can you outline for us a little bit how Canada, what are Canada's stakes in this question about Asia-Pacific security and China's rise? I know that China, of course, is also a Pacific country, but you could be a bit removed if you want, I would suppose. But I'm interested in what Canada sees as its equities in managing and handling China's rise.
Well, thanks, Steve. First thing I would say, this is my third Halifax Security Forum, and I'm just so proud as the Commander of the Navy that it happens right here at the heart of the Navy. And I hope you all enjoyed the reception on board HMCS St. John's last night.
That was great.
I would say that Canada is a Pacific nation, and what is happening in Northeast, Southeast Asia, in fact across the entire Indo-Pacific, is of vital national interest to Canada. China is Canada's second largest trading partner. Our Prime Minister has visited twice in the last couple of years, most recently earlier this year. Ministers have led delegations there. Our previous Chief of the Defense Staff visited Beijing recently. We've had very senior Chinese military delegations here. China is emerging as a global power, and it's the engine of that global power is its economy. And of course, the global economy floats. It floats on salt water. And so it's beginning to shift its sort of internal focus to a much more maritime flavored one. And for Canada as a maritime nation, it's very much in our interest to ensure that, enable China as it emerges to become part of the globalized system and to, in fact, make it better, as opposed to pushing it to a point of instability upon which would be very adverse to the flow of trade. 90% of world trade by volume, of course, floats. And so China is very much interested in Canadian energy and natural resources. We're very much interested in building trust, strategic trust and cooperation with China. And from a from a naval perspective, of course, I'll give you one sort of anecdote. You were referring to the Senkaku and the Diaoyu Islands. Two months ago, I attended the Western Pacific Naval Symposium in Kuala Lumpur, hosted by this year by Malaysia, and had the opportunity to sit between the deputy commander of the People's Liberation Army Navy and the commander of the ambassador's Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, euphemism for the Japanese Navy. And it was at a time when the island dispute was leading on CNN and BBC, and I thought, as I was sitting between the two of them, there was an opportunity for a Canadian to kind of do something extraordinary from a naval diplomatic perspective and put this thing to bed. But
how'd that go?
Well, not too well. Not too well, which is my point. I spoke with the Chinese admiral through an interpreter. I spoke with Admiral Kamano in English, a great conversation, but never was the bridge built or even considered. And I think one of the key issues here with respect to China as they emerge as a real leading nation is the ability to build bridges, to communicate, to build strategic trust and cooperation, to enable every forum like the WPNS, the East Asian Summit, ASEAN, and others, all bilateral, multilateral relationships to real advantage in order to keep the volume as low as possible.
You know, I'm going to go to Mubasher in a minute, but last year I had the privilege of interviewing Henry Kissinger about his book on China. And in there's a chapter about strategic trust. And I said, wow, I can ask Kissinger if he's still Kissinger, because of course Kissingerian thought doesn't allow for strategic trust. So I opened it up and talked about it in the green room with Henry, and I said, I'm going to ask you if you're still yourself, because you were talking about strategic trust. And Kissinger said, I would never write such a thing. And I said, but Henry, it's in the book. And he says, well, then I'll defend it. In any case, Mubasher, now, we've had, just some quick slices of sort of looking at these issues. There's a great article by Evan Feigenbaum in Foreign Policy recently. Evan was a China advisor to Mitt Romney. He now heads the Paulson Institute, University of Chicago. But he basically wrote about the sort of two Chinas or two Asias. He said, there's sort of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that's evolving. The Dr. Jekyll, which is the nicer of the two, is the economic Asia. The Dr. Hyde is the strategic Asia, is the security Asia. And if you look at the economic Asia, there's heavy amounts of economic interdependence. Everybody's investing in each other, $19 billion in sort of regional trade, which includes India. If you look at the security Asia, national enmity, border disputes, historical grievances just are driving things apart, and you're seeing real impacts on these. And India has its own problems, of course, in the region across with China, your own border disputes. Do you look at this as something that you want to be deeply engaged in, or do you look at this as basically something that India can ride along and freeload and let America and Canada and Japan handle?
Steve, your question actually...
I meant free ride, not free load, by the way.
That, by the way, is how the Chinese would describe any relationship between Japan and America. The interesting aspect of all these conflicts is that as India and China have been proximate geographically, but we have never been neighbors.
Right.
In order to be neighbors, you have to either love each other or hate each other. We've done neither. In fact, in 1962 was really the first strategic conflict between these two great lakes. And you have to understand what the Himalayas are to understand why we are not neighbors. The Himalayas are far bigger than the Atlantic and Pacific in terms of the inaccessibility. So, but the positions, the lines, the Spratlys, the Durans, the McMahon lines, what do they resonate with? The positions that are taken by post-colonial nations is that we will not be bound by decisions made by colonial powers, one, or in China's case, when we were weak, that we had to abandon our national positions. And now that we are strong, we need to resurrect them. Right or wrong is not the issue. As you know, that has very little to do with national positions. Now, the word that was there in the title of today's discussion, confusion. I come from a country, I'm proud to say that we've reached high levels of confusion without Confucius. But it's very interesting that the debate on confusion is actually in India and China is running on parallel lines. In our country, the debate on confusion was started by His Eminence Winston Churchill, when he decided that if the moment India would become free, it would descend into chaos. Now, Indians couldn't understand what he was talking about, not because they couldn't understand Churchill's English, which is also difficult to understand, but because Churchill had just presided over 4 years in which India lost 3 million people to famine. He presided, because of his war policy, he would not allow food to go to those people. The Raj had presided over 50 years, when statistics have been taken, over an annual growth in India of 1%. So Indians didn't understand what this order of the grave was all about. They wanted the confusion of independence. They wanted the confusion of self-rule. China, for me, 1947 is important because 1947 is the modern 1776. I mean, just as America is for some reason called the youngest country in the world, it is not. America is the oldest country of the modern world because the American Constitution provided us with a template for classless democracy. Not that America achieved it immediately, but certainly that was the ideological template around the world has to be structured. India is important, 1947, because India is the oldest nation of the post-colonial world. And the Indian Constitution similarly creates an ideological template for democracy, equality, and so on and so forth. But with the emergence of India also emerged China. And China had a different template. And again, not getting into what is right and what is wrong. But these were alternative visions of how to run your nation in a post-colonial society. And very interesting that we see the comparisons. Two parties, one the Congress and the Chinese Communist Party, actually became the dominant force in the post-independence phase. One advocate, both had to be positive discrimination towards the poor because both emerged from ravaged, economically driven sort of needs. The Congress offered soft left. The Chinese offered hard left or autocratic left. To cut a long story, both had charismatic leaders. Nehru,
you were
in our
just about
case,
to say long story short. I just want to get to that short part.
We are discussing it with Americans. Sorry. Had to keep it just slightly longer. But anyway, they both had charismatic leaders, but by the 80s, both realized that the economic policies that they had been following weren't working. And in one case, you had from soft left towards soft reform by the 90s, and in China's case, from hard left to hard reform.
Right.
And in both, the corruption that you say that is causing so much turbulence in nations, it has actually emerged from economic reform. Because in economic reform, a handful of people, politicians and bureaucrats, discovered that decisions made by them were creating billionaires, literally. And these decisions, if you see all the corruption, it really revolves around natural resources. Land, principle, spectrum, mining, forests, natural resources. The conventional industries are not encouraging corruption. So, but this great, tremendous septic bubble that has taken over is the most dangerous thing that has faced both countries are facing, and they have to find solutions which will come out of the anger of the people.
Well, let me just open to the panel, and everybody has we have a few minutes to talk amongst ourselves. But as I look at China and have been there, I wrote a piece after doing some interviews that what I saw China emerging with the character was fragile swagger. That you clearly saw an increasing swagger. You saw in the contest with Japan. But you also saw an insecurity complex inside China about fragility, about concern. And if I were really to put it forward, so they were complaining to me about, couldn't I get President Obama to be more clear and forceful in the things he cared about and less inconsistent, that they wanted to see structure. I don't want to get into the depth of Confucianism, but part of Confucianism is the king is the king, the minister is the minister, the father is the father, the son is the son, and then you have government, so that you have everyone in his, and I should say, or her place, though Confucianism doesn't leave much fun for that element. And that within the region and within the world, as China looks at its sense of harmony, which in Japan would be wa, that sense of harmony and how you achieve it, it's that their frustration is that the world is not just acquiescing to the notion that they are a rich country, that they are returning, that they are powerful, that they want respect, and they want to see the world kind of step back in a certain and give it greater latitude, but doesn't see this in. And this is why I personally think we're on a collision course, because when you look at what China's expectations of the world are, you also look at its paranoia and its mercantilism. You look at, Jim, I'd love to hear you talk about, you're such an expert in cyber, what's going on in the cyber world. You see something where it seems hard to me, despite our best efforts and not wanting to replay history, that the rise of a great power usually and often leads to messiness, usually and often leads to conflict. And so I'd love to get just some conversation from those of you who are thinking seriously. This is supposed to be a no-nonsense forum on military and security strategy. I don't want you to predict war, but I think it's easy to predict conflict given history, given what we see as mutual expectations. I'd love to hear why that's not going to happen given the work of all of your governments and India today.
I just wanted to ask a question here
of
our Japanese colleague, which is that one of the important elements of the new power structures, both in India and China, is the role of the family, which is very Confucius and our traditional ways of looking, and almost nepotism as seen as a sort of pseudo-moral duty. What is the role of family in Japan?
I think it's Japan is a kind of democratic and free society, so the social value, are also changing. And but of course, probably like other countries, we very much cherish the family ties, and also maybe in our expressing ourselves, we try to be kind of polite to the elders. That is probably could be a kind of influence of the Confucianism. But when it comes to the international relationship, I don't think that that kind of thing would much kick in.
But what does matter is that Japan has election on December 16th, and Shinzo Abe might be back. And Abe, worried about China, was trying to put together a league of democracies in the region, including India, because that was his strategy, that if you put together things there. So I'd much more like to hear what you think. I mean, I know you can't, in your position, talk one way or another about prime ministers, but this notion about a strategic, does Japan really need to invest in structures that balance, are you worried now, given your experience, that you have to balance China much more vigorously than you did in the past?
Yes. If we most frequently asked question for a Japanese diplomat is that whether we regard China as a threat or a chance. And our answer is we would like to see China's development as a chance, not a threat. But
that's what you hope. But what do you think will really happen?
And there is assumption that China continues to be a kind of international stakeholder in the international community, and they respect the international order, and they respect the communication with the other countries. On that assumption, I think we can welcome the China's advancement and the development, and in order to maintain the prosperity of the East Asia or Asia Pacific as a whole, China is a very, very critical element, and we'd like to embrace China as a kind of the source of the prosperity in the region. But it's really up to China's which course they're going to take.
Jim, yeah, go ahead, please.
If I could just add, obviously we have a strong interest in a stable, prosperous, and growing China. And as we look at how to engage that China and how we engage more broadly in the region, I just outlined very briefly 4 key elements. The first is principles, and that includes That includes, as we think about the South China Sea moving toward a code of conduct, as we think about the Senkakus, it includes the principle that these disputes will not be resolved by force or the threat of force, but through diplomacy. It also includes, as we think about broadly economically, the idea of a level playing field, and that means it means that we have, I think, very legitimate concerns about the theft of intellectual property, including through cyberspace. Mm-hmm. So the principles are critical.
Which is a pretty profound problem.
It is a very significant issue. It's very significant. Part two, and it's in a sense represented by the team up here, is partnerships. And as we look at the United States rebalance to the Asia Pacific, both our existing alliances and new partnerships, including with India and Indonesia, not really new, but I hope reinvigorated partnerships. But our partnership with China is critical too. And as we look at both opportunities to build on cooperation and frankly opportunities to compete economically and then to avoid any prospect, any likelihood of conflict. So those are a critical element. And as we think about the international institutions, including both regional and more broad international institutions, those are a key part of that as well. To us, the other two P's I'm going to put in are presence. We have 60 years of history where the United States has provided a stabilizing role toward economic development, and the fact that most of the international trade floats on seawater, as the Admiral noted, is a key part of that. And we have a strong interest, and we believe that not just the Asia-Pacific region, but the international community does. So as we continue to sustain and enhance our presence, see that as a stabilizing function. And finally, at the end of the day, we need to have the capacity as a U.S. military for power projection as well. That's a global capability, but that means that irrespective of choices that are made by other powers, we want the ability to sustain our presence in the Asia Pacific. Same's true in the Middle East. Same's true around the globe. As you look at these different areas, I think that there are terrific opportunities to engage with China on each of them, and to fundamentally ask the question and try to answer the question that Secretary Clinton and State Councilor Dai Bingguo had been engaged in for some time, and that is, can we get a better answer than we've typically had in the past to how a new rising power comes into the international system? In other words, can we do so without running significant risks or indeed falling into conflict?
Thanks. Yes, please.
I'll just say I agree with everything the Undersecretary has said here, and in fact, Admiral Sam Locklear underscored those points just a couple of days ago in Australia. You're talking about engagement and that strategic trust piece again. But it's interesting that the Chinese tend to look at the American Asia-Pacific pivot as a sort of a containment strategy, and which speaks to the inability to really communicate with strategic effect. And I think you touched, Steve, on a very important piece, which was this inferiority complex, if I can put it that way. And it is, China has felt that they were abused by major powers through the 19th century and well into the 20th century, and that has an interesting counterbalance, which is they seem to have a bit of a superiority complex about the solutions that they are building, about how China emerges as a global power. This containment piece is a bit of a challenge. The South China Sea, the entire challenge there. The Chinese are making claims that really, with respect to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, are fairly outrageous. And what they are looking for, I think, at the end of the day, is respect. Respect at the table, and respect for who they are and what they are doing. And somehow we need to find the means to bring these two solitudes together, because at the end of the day, any conflict, whether it's kinetic or otherwise, that adversely affects the flow of trade through that part of the world will have a fundamentally adverse impact on the global economy and the system of the world.
It's doing it now with China and Japan. I mean, that's what's interesting is that you've got two of the biggest economies in the world in a nightmare situation that raises the fundamental question, and it's upending this myth that economics draws people closer together. Part of the title today is mischief or miscalculation. Right. During the Cold War with U.S.-Soviet relations, what was really interesting is you could have 17 different spheres of contact with the Soviets, and if 2 of them blew up, you could still have 15 others. There was a lot of heavy investment in figuring out how to communicate, how to coordinate, how to deal with escalation, how to talk if things really got bad. And in this era, when I look at the amount of time, particularly in the Obama administration, even much more than the George W. Bush administration, but if you look at senior officials who appear, go to Asia, meet throughout the region at whether it's ASEAN or APEC meetings or others, and also the discussion and attempts to coordinate with China, there seems to be a lot of effort to try to coordinate. But again, coming back, it was Jim Steinberg was the 4th member of this panel with Hadley and Armitage and Joe Nye looking at the Senkaku Diaoyu Island dispute, and said they were shocked and surprised by the level of miscommunication, misassessment, and the dangers of that between China and Japan. And so it raises the fundamental question of whether or not, I agree with you, I know China wants respect, but whether or not what you're seeing is a strategic game or a tactical game by China to use this potential misassessment to kind of look like the unstable part in some of this to basically help push out its own interests. And that worries me a little bit. Mubashir?
See, I think the essential question is not of domination or respect. It's about whether the equilibrium will be static or whether the equilibrium will be dynamic.
Right.
And there is no way that nations are going to agree on what they consider to be their core interests. And you drop a little bit of energy into this thing, and it becomes explosive. As you know, it's all energy-driven, many of these claims. But the issue really is, and that is what the emerging world, whether it's China, whether it's India, from completely different perspectives. I mean, I've seen India and China when we went to China in 2004, maybe 2003. The trade between India and China was maybe $2 billion. I mean, it was nothing. It used to be called a mango-driven trade. It is an absurdity. Today, I think this month when the Chinese Prime Minister comes to India, we are going to talk of 150 billion as the next horizon. This is without withdrawing on McMahon line issues, with is withdrawing on claims. So I think what Asia is looking for, and Asia is going to find this dynamic, is that we can have correlations within each other without necessarily being dictated to. Now, it's a dangerous game, but all games are dangerous. As Kissinger has created a lifetime career out of danger. But this is the way it is, and military power as a dominant element of strategy will not work. As a background element of strategy, yes, essential, important, including, I mean, for the first time 2 years ago, Pentagon had a conference, I was there, in which we discussed India and American cooperation in the Pacific. Never happened before. This doesn't mean that suddenly the two admirals and navies are going to march ahead and conquer Spratly Islands. But we are taking positions which are cooperative, which are dynamic, and which recognize that nations change, people change, and we have to keep abreast of changing ambitions, if you like.
Let me, before I open to the audience, let me just pose one last thing, and Jim, maybe others. I looked today to see how much China held in U.S. Treasury reserves. It's 1.55 trillion, and Japan's is 1.31 trillion, but they're going like this. And we often talk about national security issues in terms of ships and tanks and planes and power in a classical sense. But there's just no doubt that economies matter. And I think that, whether it's been Leon Panetta, Bob Gates, Admiral Mullen, the constant focus on the economic dynamism of the country. I don't know Canada's net account position with China. But it does raise this fundamental question of whether American debt is an asset or a liability. was a conference in Davos yesterday, or recently, where someone made the comment that America's sources of power today are very different in the past, that it's the size of the Pentagon and the size of American debt. They were too big to fail, and those debt holders actually have a bigger problem than us. But I'd be interested in, when you're in and thinking about policy, and Yamazaki-san, from a Japan perspective, it'd be interesting too on the economic side, do you look at that as a source of leverage, or does this constrain American options tremendously in terms of what you can do?
Steve, very, very simply, the U.S. situation with respect to our deficit and debt is a national security liability. We need our senior leadership, to the senator here, need our senior leadership to take it on. We have an opportunity to do so. We have a requirement to do so. And the foundation of national power is ultimately economic, and if in terms of global influence, in terms of the ability to support a military, the economic is foundational, and we have, I think, in the United States, both an opportunity and really a requirement to get our house in order. And I believe that our 100 senators and 435 members of the House will step up, or at least a sufficient majority will in the coming months.
Yamazaki-san, how do you look at your surplus with the U.S.? Does that say, wow, we've got America under our control because we're holding $1 trillion of treasuries?
No, we are one of the closest allies of the United States. So, of course, our position to the United States is very, very decisive to strengthen our relationship, and so we do not. There is no intention for us to kind of use this kind of economic relationship in a different context. So we are very satisfied with the current relationship with the United States. That's all.
Let me open up to the floor now. We've got 4 microphones around the room. Let me start. Well, lots of questions, so we're going to go fast. Josh Rogan over here, and I will call on people whose names I don't know, but that's Josh Rogan. So ask Josh from the cable at Foreign Policy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time today. So I think we can all agree that the #1 issue that poses a risk of conflict with China is its disputes over islands and territories with its neighbors. And a large part of the U.S. strategy on encouraging the resolution of those disputes is to urge China to subjugate itself to international codes of conduct, multilateral dispute mechanisms, etc. The Chinese response typically is, that's fine, but there's no reason to use those mechanisms in the case of X because that island or territory is ours, so there's no dispute. Now, of course, the push for China to move towards those mechanisms is undermined by the fact that neither Japan nor South Korea, for that matter, is willing to follow that logic on whatever island or territory they claim was theirs since the 14th century or whatever. So my question is, will the Japanese submit to these types of multilateral dispute resolution mechanisms regarding the islands that they claim? And will the U.S. urge its allies to use these mechanisms in the same way it urges the Chinese to use these mechanisms? Thank you.
Yes, Yamazaki.
Yes. When it comes to the Senkaku Island, I don't want to get into the details, but it is very, very clear and simple that that island belongs to Japan, and there is no, from our viewpoint, there is no elements to be disputed. And if you
there was a very interesting Nick Kristof article that basically said that there was, during the Tokugawa period, a recognition, when the Ryukyu line came, and maybe I'm wrong about Tokugawa period, but there was a recognition of control by China over that island. It's an interesting piece that raised questions, because I thought I'd always read the Japan line. Then Nick Kristof came in and said, let's look at the material, and how did the Ryukyus, how did the Okinawan Kingdom look at these islands, and how did Japan? That there does seem to be a legitimate historical dispute. I just want to put that marker down there, at least from Nick Kristof in the New York Times.
I cannot speak for other the private author.
Right,
Well, I can speak for China.
You could say Nick Kristof is wrong.
But for example, as far as I know, the China's claim is that in Ming Dynasty, which is from 13th century to 6th century, some ships come closer to the island and saw that island. That's all. And that is our understanding. So Of course, so this is not, we are discussing based on the modern international law.
Right.
So that does not
So I know the
constitute
United
it.
States recognizes the administrative culture. From India's perspective, who think owns those islands?
Sorry? Jim?
Who do you think has control of those islands?
Whoever has the better navy.
Got it.
Right on MJ.
I won't put that to you. This gentleman right here, yes.
Is this on? Henry
Yes.
Rothschild from Canada. We heard last night that technology is often a forgotten factor in international security. Right now, it's not a forgotten factor with
Right.
China, which is bulking up on its science and research capacity. This year, I believe the numbers show that about 50 million Chinese men and women are involved in the enterprise of scientific research. Like everything else, it has a Jekyll and Hyde personality, but let's leave aside the Hyde personality for a moment, the cyber issues, intellectual property, which are important. There's some positive aspects to it. One could argue that that rather large segment of the Chinese population is probably one of the most globally connected and open parts. And looking at a way of engaging China and seeing China's place in the world on this important aspect of economic development and political development, how do you see this playing out? I know that both India and Japan have engaged China on research cooperation. Is this serious, or is this a missed opportunity?
So responses on the Dr. Jekyll technology parks.
Well, let me just say that science, technology, engineering, and math, fundamental to the growth of economies. The United States obviously has work to do there. I'll just say my oldest daughter is doing her doctorate in math, so one of the Millers is making a substantial contribution to national security in any case. With respect to the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if economic growth is fundamental and innovation is the key engine for that, and freedom is in a sense the foundation for that, I think that we will see this play out in some interesting ways globally, including within China. As we work to have a very open system economically and take advantage of technology for trade, we do need to also look at what needs to be done to deal with the threats of not just cyber, but also biotech and so on. And we ought to look at doing that in partnership, both with our close allies and partners that we've worked with historically, but also be able to have that conversation with China. One of the things that I've spent some time on is beginning to have a substantive conversation about rules of the road in cyberspace with the Chinese. We're doing that with many others as well, but it is a fundamental issue.
Right here.
Yes, Gal Luft from Institute for Analysis of Global Security. I think that the issue of the islands is primarily an issue of energy. And we're seeing it all over the world today that we don't have good mechanisms to deal with maritime energy disputes. It's not only in the East China Sea, it's in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's the Falklands. Arctic is coming up. And with regards to China and Japan, those two countries are not fighting over a bunch of rocks. They're fighting over a potential energy reserves that nobody even knows what is in there. They may be fighting over something very little. They may be fighting over something very vast. And the nature of offshore maritime energy reserves is that until you go in and you really explore and you understand what you're actually fighting over, you will be positioning yourself, building your big navies for the day that you will know what is actually happening down there. And at that point, Japan will be, if it pursues its current energy proposal of getting off nuclear power, will be heavily dependent on natural gas. China, which is now running out of coal, will be heavily dependent on natural gas. And at that point, we're going to get this very, very inflaming situation. So I think that what needs to be done is to go in now, figuring out what is the extent of the reserve, what are we actually disputing over, and begin to establish an international mechanism to deal with disputes, whether it's in the context of the International Energy Agency, which China is not a member of and should be, or an independent one. But unless we understand this as an energy issue and not fight over rocks, we will not be able to get to the root of it.
Thanks for your comment. I'm going to gather some others, including this gentleman, but hand your mic to Jack. Just want to say an important point, because there's a distinction between what you just said, that this could be a fight over an earnest issue, an asset, versus a fight over strategic lines and the perception of power. I think that's a very important distinction. Jack, and then this gentleman in the far back, and then we'll work to Eamon and Elisa.
Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Jack James from Washington. I just want to pick up on that.
And brevity will get gold stars.
Sorry?
Brevity will get gold stars.
Foreign policy says that the China's economy is more oil intensive than either America or Europe, with half of its imported oil coming from the Middle East and North Africa. They had to evacuate 30,000 Chinese from Libya during that period of time of the unrest. The question I would raise is the need for China to stabilize its sources of oil and energy reserves from that part of the world going to lead to the same kind of ambition to sustain that with a geopolitical force in the form of a blue water navy, as we have over the last 60, 70 years. Is that going to lead to the kind of conflict that we're talking about here?
Yes, sir.
Bill Graham, Canada. Maybe a quick comment on the resource issue. I'd take issue with whether or not it's better to know what's there or not there. Canada and the United States have an interesting discussion about the border between Alaska and Northern Canada.
They have great op-ed, the benefits of ambiguity.
I think we were a lot better off when it was terras nullius and not when you knew how many barrels of oil it was going to count to each nation's economy. But anyway, that's an aside. I'd like to ask MJ a question as to moving from the flashpoint at the moment, the longer-term issue of the Indian Ocean and seeing China bases in Sri Lanka, in Baluchistan. Does India regard this as a legitimate protection by China of its sea lanes for commerce with Africa, where it's got significant oil, or does it see it as an encirclement of India and therefore a strategic threat to India as opposed to a legitimate protection of its commercial sea lanes?
Thank you. Let me go to Lisa here. Lots of questions.
Elisa Massimino from Washington. With all of the talk about Jekyll and Hyde, I was surprised that none of you mentioned the question of how China treats its own people and human rights. And I wonder, earlier this year when the blind human rights lawyer Chen Guangchen escaped to the U.S. Embassy, it was, let's say, awkward for Secretary Clinton at the time, but it ultimately led her to say that human rights has to be at the heart of diplomacy with China. I'd just like to hear how each of you views the question of how China treats its own people, whether it's labor rights, human rights, environmental justice, in terms of the long-term relationship between democracies and China.
There are a lot of questions. I'm going to take Eamon's and then give the panel, and then we'll work from this gentleman on around the other half. But Eamon, quickly.
Thank you, Steve. But my question is really for Mr. Miller. America's strategy comes down to borrowing from China to save the world from China. This is not a sustainable strategy. So America has to get its economic house in order. And there are a couple of numbers that are really relevant here. One is that the current account deficit, the widest measure of trade, runs about 4 to 5% of GDP now. And manufacturing is about 11% of GDP. Services hardly produce any exports. So how do you square this circle?
Great, thank you. So we've got a lot of questions on the table, from energy and whether we should have ambiguity on what's in the South China Sea or not, Indian Ocean bases, China human rights, and the question about borrowing from China to save the world from China. So I'm going to start with you, Paul.
Okay. I'll touch on the human rights question first, because I know it's a real strategic dilemma for nations that are engaged primarily economically with China, because there's always has to be a human rights imperative, and so that it's either the elephant in the room or it's the challenge to getting into the agreement space you want to be in. But that be said, there are 400 or 500 million Chinese living on the same per capita income as Nigeria at $2 a day. And that's obviously a real concern for the Chinese in a one-party state where the military and the internal security forces are also party entities. So a real challenge. I'd like to touch on also the question about questions about the islands. I think the island disputes are really a tactical demonstration of something much more strategically important, which is whether the rule of law at sea. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, I think, is one of the most important international agreements, perhaps the most important agreement of the 20th century, because it resolved the conflict between state control over resources at sea and the need for the freedom of the sea to enable globalized trade. And so whenever there is pressure put on the system of UNCLOS, that pressure needs to be challenged, because if it is not, then there will be other nations who will push the limits of UNCLOS in a way that could become, in aggregate, quite destabilizing in the 21st century. And so it's very important, I think, to look at the South China Sea, the 9-dash line, to ask what is China's real ambition here. When they talk about their naval strategy, their harmonious seas, and the rapid expansion of their navy, they use the term active defense. So they are taking that sort of continental, interior-looking view and then applying it at sea to protect themselves, but also to, I think, secure the sea lines of communication for that energy flow into Asia. And as long as it's done in a constructive way that enables UNCLOS and global governance to hopefully be improved, then that's good. The contrary is not.
Thank you, Admiral Mubasher.
I'll start from the question on China's, the pearls of the ocean, old Portuguese term of the Indian Ocean, 50 forts. India certainly doesn't take very kindly to the construction of Gwadar, which is the Balochistan port, a massive, massive infrastructural development. It's not simply a port. It is a whole new city. It's a base. It's much more than that. And I think it just draws your attention to not just what India thinks of it, but Gwadar is at the heart not only of the world's most dangerous war zone, but also the world's most dangerous civil war zone. And that really, while we are discussing many things, we are underestimating the potential of havoc within Pakistan upon many of these new infrastructures that are being developed. And China now is certainly far more concerned about Xinjiang and south of it, the Muslim regions, than it used to be 5 years ago. There have been attacks on the Chinese settlements and on engineers and so on that region. Karachi itself, there have been sort of attacks within Karachi, which the Pakistani forces have not been able to contain, and they just forget about it without an investigation. So what we are seeing is not simply the construction of facilities. We are seeing the construction of fortresses that may or not be within the control of those who have built them, with consequences that we will all see it emerge. I wonder also, while we are discussing Iran, and it's at the top of everyone's concern and visibility, whether we are forgetting that Pakistan is nuclear, and it may be more dangerous potentially than Iran's nuclear force. That in fact what we are getting is a nuclear crescent of contiguous nuclear powers. Israel, Iran, potentially, Pakistan actually, India certainly, China very definitely, Japan potentially, North Korea occasionally, and then Russia. And 70% of the world's energy is here. So what does, when energy becomes so dramatically contagious, what do you do? And briefly on human rights, I do believe actually that the great difference between a democracy and a dictatorship is simply this. It's a soft asset, but a very important one. that while India certainly doesn't have a record on human rights that I would necessarily be proud of, but India has accountability. And therefore, I believe that whereas China may be a successful nation, it cannot be a modern nation. And it can only become a modern nation if it permits democracy and if it permits secularism, that is, the equality and presence of faiths. Until then, it will be successful but not modern.
James?
Steve, let me say three things very quickly. First, I want to just follow directly on the Admiral's comments about the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is remarkable to many in the U.S. military that the United States has not ratified the convention. We had a pretty sincere effort to bring it forward to the Senate. We were a couple of votes short. I thank Senator Mikulski for her encouragement and support. I hope that we'll be able to take that up again and get that done as a country. It is challenging to make the case that we are making, which is that these potential conflicts over territory from the Caucasus to Scarborough Shoal to Reed Bank and so on should be resolved on the basis of principles, when the fundamental convention that governs us is one that we haven't ratified. So I would put.
I don't want to burn much time here, but I just want to push back on one point, because I see you raising the profile of this. I respect what Barbara Mikulski has done, but George W. Bush supported that treaty. Richard Lugar supported that treaty. I asked Harry Reid a few years ago, why, now you're back in power, you've got this, you've got the president, why aren't you pushing? He says, Steve, I just wish we had time. So, I mean, for all of the angst about Law of the Sea, both parties have let it sit, despite being so violent. So I just, as a journalist, want to remind people that there's been an institutional neglect on both sides, which I credit the senator for now moving, but it's been interesting how people didn't see this before in earlier periods.
Steve, I think that's fair. The reality is, in the last session, we were literally one vote short from being able to move it forward. I should say the Senate was. It was something that certainly the Department of Defense supported. I would put that, despite its importance, I would put that behind us taking steps to get our economic house in order. It's fundamental to our long-term security. It's fundamental to our global leadership role. And it's really the foundation of our long-term power and influence as a nation. And with respect to human rights, one of the principles, to follow very directly on your comments, one of the principles that we need to understand and to follow is that human rights do matter.
Yamazaki-san.
Yes, I'd like to take up two issues very promptly. One is, first thing is energy. And in East China Sea, when President Hu Jintao made an official visit to Japan in 2008, we made an agreement with the Chinese government to exploit jointly the oil wells in East China Sea. And we wanted to start the consultation based on the agreement, but China kept refusing to hold the follow-up meetings. So even though there was an agreement between the two leaders of the countries, no development. So we are very much disappointed with the current situation. And Senkaku Island, that is a sovereignty issue. They are claiming it's their island. So it's totally different dimension from the energy issue. Human rights. We also highly regard the human rights, place importance to the human rights situation in China, and we have a bilateral consultation with them. But living in China for 2 years, as a part of the human rights, the information sphere in China is totally different from Canada, United States, and Japan. They do not, the people in China do not share the same information as we have here. And you can compare the two Nobel Prizes that China took, Peace Prize and the literature. As you know, that their information diffusion inside the country is totally different. Very little people know about the Peace Prize. So this is one of the example. So there's there's a broad room to be improved in China. That is our perception.
Great. So, folks, we have a hard stop at 11:30, which is like in 4 or 5 minutes. So I'm going to ask for 30-second interventions. And we'll zap, because I believe we get as many voices on. But right here, this gentleman. Oh, well, you go ahead, but 30 seconds.
It's okay, I can speak up.
Oh, no, you got to do it on, this is this is recorded.
Thank you very much. One of the features of this panel is miscalculation.
Right.
And if we go back to the Cold War era, we can see that one of the important artifacts is the incidence of sea agreement between the Soviets and the Americans in 1972.
Can you just identify yourself for the...
Jim Boutillier, I work with the Canadian Navy.
Terrific, thank you. And let's go right down here.
And I'm really interested in the whole question of the potential for instability at sea in East Asian waters as a result of the utilization of fishing craft as proxies or various other non-military or paramilitary naval forces. So what is the potential for some sort of agreement to diffuse these miscalculations?
Great question, which I'm sure we're going to get to during coffee. Right here.
Nathalie Nogueret from Paris Le Monde. I wanted to ask the panelists, what did you think of China's plan for a solution for Syria? China came out recently with a four-point plan. Did you take this seriously? And if so, could this be part of the new normal, i.e. China looking at a crisis that the West is unable to solve, far from its shores, and saying, we have a position to take and we can play a role on this?
Run to the back row. Right, this gentleman here. Hand up high. Thank you for your brevity, folks.
Thank you. Richard Downey from the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies.
Yeah.
Early in the discussion, you had asked Yamasaki-san about the Senkaku Islands, the dispute, and your response was that the Chinese response was part of a long-term plan. In recent years, we've seen China make tremendous efforts, certainly in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa, to build an infrastructure to gain access to raw materials. And at the same time, we've also seen them make tremendous efforts to build military-to-military relations. And my question for the panel is that military dimension just an effort to protect their economic interests, or is it some part of a long-term plan to help lay the foundations for their ascent to their position as a global power?
Next, I'm going to take this one last gentleman in the what Neil Diamond would call the tree people way back. Hot August night. This gentleman, yes. Run the mic to him. Oh, we'll come to you too. Well, wait just a second. Wait just a second.
Yeah.
You go ahead.
Thank you. Russell Trude from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Look, none of us should be complacent about China's rise, and there's likely to be challenges ahead, but I actually think we should pay closer attention to the kinds of things that the Chinese are saying about themselves and their own priorities, and in particular we should be paying close attention to the remarks of the soon-to-be new president of China, Chairman Xu, whose speech 48 hours ago made some very important points about the challenges that China has domestically in relation to its social change, in relation to its economic situation, and in relation to what he called, interestingly, lifestyle. Which this was a speech which was very different in style and tone and content to recent speeches, and it deserves closer attention.
Totally agree. You get the final comment here before we go to the panel.
First comment is about Nicholas Kristof's article, and this is not accurate. And they are using the document which is archived from our institute library in a very different context, so very inaccurate.
This is Nick Kristof's article?
Yes.
Okay, so Nick, we had, that's a strong statement. Nick Kristof is wrong. That's helpful. So we have, just very quickly, and I want to say, I asked our friends on stage what they did, what their hobbies were. And Paul's is hockey. Mawasher's is cricket, not surprisingly, kind of. Jim's is tennis, and Yamazaki-san is a skier. And I'm fascinated by this, not that you have to sort of adopt national sports, but there was one time I was in a forum, Ali Larjani made the comment that India or Iran will beat the United States because Iran plays chess and America plays baseball. I remember during the Gulf War, Toshiki Kaifu said, Americans play tennis, we play golf, I think it was. And to a certain degree, when you think about these kind of questions about strategy and how you're thinking, I do think that those I know that think, because we have this question about where is China going, how is it thinking about its world, how is it thinking about stuff. My sense is that Chinese strategists are very smart, have a plan, begin looking at assets, and I don't know the Chinese name for go, but but the black chips and the white chips on the table, that when you look at assets around the world and how they're moving them, I tend to think that when I think about U.S. strategy, I can't speak for Canadians, but I could think about, with the exception of Jim Miller, we tend to be more reactive right now, in my view, than we are strategic. But I do sense that there's a strategic game that China's playing with. So in closing, beyond responding to the final comments from those that we assembled, I'd love to just get a quick snapshot of your assessment of Chinese strategy in the world, and whether you take it seriously or whether you think China just simply wants to lie low and not push these buttons. We'll start with Yamazaki-san as quickly as possible, please.
Yes, China is trying, of course, China is trying to advance to the world and secure energy, resources, and influence. That is their goal. But it's natural, in a sense, it's natural for any country to do so. The problem is whether they will abide by the international rule and follow the international kind of consensus. That's matter. And that is my kind of perspective.
Great, thank you. Jim?
I see a lot of very strong strategic thought and a good history of strategic thought, obviously, in China, and I see them taking a long-term view. And as they do that, I believe that the Chinese have the same interest that we and the rest of the international community of managing their rise in the international system. And that will take active management. That will take the type of discussion that we've referred to today. And just a brief comment on the question about China's role in international diplomacy. If we look at what they've done with respect to the six-party talks and the very positive role they played in engaging North Korea recently, as we look at their continued role in the P5+1 with respect to Iran, and I think that will be an interesting conversation in the coming months. I think you're seeing them play a more active and more positive role in international diplomacy. We have on Syria. We have some work to do. You saw where we're headed with respect to Syria, based on Secretary Clinton's recent comments. But China is strategic. China has strong interests in managing its ascension as a global power. By the way, not the only rising power in the neighborhood, and it's something that we share. And I believe that both we, as in the United States, and the community of democracies, and have the ability to act strategically and act together, and doing it based on, I'll just take the first two principles, and partnership is going to be critical.
Thank you. Mubashir, quickly.
Yes, we are a rising power. We just don't have a large advertising campaign. But I just want a brief comment on China's Syria plan. It has nothing to do with healing Syria, which is quite a separate issue. And it has everything to do with wounding America. In this, China and Russia have actually got together, and overtures have been sent to Delhi in some form or the other to join some sort of a deal, if you want to use that four-letter word. But, and India thankfully has resisted, and India keeps its options much more nuanced and flexible. China's national game, Dr. Kissinger has 3 chapters in his book on the game. The interesting thing about that game is it is very Beijing-centric, because the game is not allowed to touch them, but they're allowed to touch everyone else. And that game is very relevant to how they behave, particularly with their neighbors. I mean, you have to bow, kowtow, and then the rest is fine. Just one on our national game in India, if that helps us all to understand us. The good thing about cricket is it isn't a single game. It's many games. And so when we want to pay fast forward, we turn to T20 cricket. But the diplomatic game is the test match. It goes across 5 days. It's unheard of for any sport to go across 5 days. But the Indians and the British are good at it. We're trying to teach the Australians, but...
Thank you. Paul? Final word, Paul.
It's hard to follow the cricket, but what I would say is, in closing, is I think Chinese strategy will be increasingly focused on internal challenges, as a huge emerging middle class, probably ignited by some sort of democratic momentum, will come into conflict with a one-party state. But externally, they will continue to look for energy, as the ambassador has said. meaning they have to engage with the system of the world, and we hope that it is a positive engagement, a constructive one, and not one that brings more conflict around the globe.
I apologize to the many of you who had questions that we couldn't get to. I hope we will continue during coffee. I want to thank, and let us all thank, Ambassador Kazuyuki Yamazaki, Undersecretary of Defense James Miller, Mobashir Akbar, and Vice Admiral Paul Madison. Thank you so much for your insights and thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And let's remember, we don't get a great panel discussion without a great moderator, and Steve has certainly been that. So thank you very much. And take a look at who's on the next panel at 12 o'clock, and you'll see why we'd love you to be back exactly on time, please.
Sir, do you mind just asking if anybody sees a flash, if they could drop it off to the...